Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at two words that sound really similar but have very different meanings. Exacerbate and exasperate.
Yeah, it's funny how one little change in the word can make such a big difference.
Exactly. And we've got a lot of great sources for this one. We've got some definitions from Cambridge and RxList. We've even got some quotes in a YouTube video breaking down the differences. We're going to be unpacking these definitions and exploring some examples. And hopefully we can find some interesting stuff along the way.
I think it's really interesting that these words, even though we use them every day, can teach us something about like larger social dynamics or even global issues.
Ooh, that's getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's start with exacerbate. Cambridge defines it as to make a bad situation worse. Kind of like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. But it's important to remember that exacerbate doesn't like create the fire. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just makes an existing problem worse. Think of it like this. You've got a headache and then there's construction outside your window. The noise doesn't cause the headache, but it definitely makes it worse.
Okay, so it makes something bad even worse. The medical definition from RxList uses this same idea. They use the word exacerbation to talk about a condition getting worse, like if pollution makes an asthma attack worse.
Right, and that example shows how exacerbate doesn't mean just making something a little bit worse. It means like a lot worse.
So the YouTube video we found uses this mosquito bite example. You know how if you scratch a mosquito bite, it just makes the itching worse?
Ugh, yeah, it's so true. Although, like, sometimes you just gotta scratch it, you know?
Yeah, I totally get that. But when you're scratching it, you're actually making the problem worse in the long run.
Exactly. It just shows how sometimes we try to make something better, but we actually just make it worse.
And speaking of making things worse, there was one example sentence from the Cambridge corpus that really stuck with me. Rivalrous relationships are distinct, inasmuch as violence exacerbates mutual insecurities that already run deep.
Ooh, that's a good one. That's interesting because now we're seeing how to use exacerbate to talk about emotions between people and not just like physical things. The violence doesn't create the insecurity, but it makes it way worse. It just makes the whole relationship more complicated.
Yeah, so we're seeing how exacerbate can be used for anything from headaches to rivalries. But what about its tricky twin, exasperate? Cambridge says it means to annoy, frustrate, or infuriate. Is rush hour traffic a good example of something that's exasperating?
Oh, for sure. But I think an even better example is trying to put together furniture that's missing instructions.
Right.
There's nothing dangerous about it, but it's just so frustrating when you can't figure it out.
Oh, yeah. That feeling when you're just totally lost. I'm reminded of this quote from Katie Kakiensky. She made this fake warning label for falling in love, and it lists exasperation as a side effect right next to heartache and Cheeto cravings.
Oh, that's hilarious. And it's so true. It shows how exasperation comes from things that are happening around you, but it's really an emotion inside of you. It's not making the situation worse. It's just describing how you feel about it.
So I've got a good handle on the definitions now. Exacerbate means to make a bad situation worse, and exasperate means to feel annoyed or frustrated. But the YouTube video talks about the etymology of these words, which I think is really cool.
Me too. It's like you're going back in time to see how these words got their meanings. Exacerbate comes from the Latin acers, which means bitter or sharp. So to exacerbate something is to make it more bitter or more unpleasant.
And exasperate comes from the Latin word asper, which means rough. It's like you're taking something that's already annoying and making it harder to deal with.
It's so cool how even today, those old Latin meanings still kind of make sense with how we use those words. Exacerbate makes me think of something getting worse and sharper.
While exasperate is like something getting rougher and harder to deal with. It's amazing how language changes, but still keeps some of its old meaning.
Totally. So now let's think about how we use these words in different situations. The YouTube video says that exacerbate and exasperate are kind of formal. Can we use these words when we're just talking to our friends?
Yeah, good question. Like, can I tell my friend that their interruptions are exacerbating my headache? Or would that sound weird?
Well, I guess it depends on your friend and how you usually talk to them. But I think it makes sense to use exacerbate in that situation because you're explaining how what they're doing is affecting you.
So it's not just about being formal, it's about picking the right word to explain what you mean.
Exactly. And that's what makes language so interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
You really have to think about the different ways to use words.
Absolutely. It's so interesting how those Latin roots, acers for exacerbate and asper for exasperate, can help us really understand these words. Exacerbate makes me think of something getting like sharper and more intense.
Yeah.
And exasperate is like something getting rougher and more annoying.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like knowing the definition isn't enough. You have to like really understand what the word means. Like the difference between a poke and a scratch. They
Yeah.
both hurt, but in different ways.
Okay, so let's play around with these words a bit. We were talking about how scratching a mosquito bite can exacerbate the itch.
Right.
What if we think of that itch like as a metaphor for a big problem in society, like economic inequality?
That's interesting. Makes you wonder if some things that seem like good ideas are actually just making the problem worse, you know?
Yeah.
Like they're putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It might help for a second, but it doesn't fix the real problem.
Yeah. Like one of those optical illusions where two lines look different lengths,
Yeah.
but they're actually the same. Sometimes what looks like a solution is actually making things worse.
Exactly. And this idea of making things worse can apply to so many things. We were talking about rush hour traffic being exasperating.
Right.
What if we think about a whole community where people are frustrated because there isn't good public transportation?
That's interesting because now it's not just one person who's exasperated. It's like a whole group of people who are frustrated by the same problem.
Right. And it makes you think, who's responsible for fixing these problems? Is it up to each person to just deal with it? Or do we need to fix the bigger problems that are causing it?
So earlier we said that violence can exacerbate insecurities in a rivalry.
Right.
Could we use that same idea for like countries and stuff?
For sure. Think about how wars or even just like mean things politicians say can make countries hate each other even more. Then it becomes way harder for them to make peace. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. It doesn't start the fire, but it makes it way worse.
So it seems like we use exacerbate when something has the potential to get really out of control.
You know, that's a really smart point. It shows how we can use language not just to describe stuff, but also to think critically about it.
So these words can describe how one person feels, but we can also use them to understand complicated stuff in society and politics.
Exactly. That's what I love about language. It can connect things that seem totally different and help us see patterns we didn't even know were there.
It's like zooming out on a camera.
Yeah.
Suddenly we see the bigger picture and how everything is connected. But speaking of connections, there's something we haven't talked about yet. What happens when you mix up exacerbate and exasperate?
Oh, yeah.
It's so easy to accidentally say the wrong one.
Oh, it happens all the time. And it's totally understandable since they sound so similar. But we have to be careful because using the wrong word can totally change what you're trying to say.
Imagine if you told someone that their complaining was exacerbating the situation, when you actually meant that it was exasperating you.
Oh, no.
That would cause some problems.
Yeah, it shows how important it is to choose the right word, especially when you're talking about something important or emotional.
So how can we stop ourselves from making this mistake?
Well, the more you use these words, the better you'll get at using them correctly.
So those real-life examples from the Cambridge corpus and those quotes we talked about can really help us.
Definitely. They show us how to actually use these words in sentences, not just how to define them.
It's like learning to dance. You can read the steps in a book, but you need to actually get out there and try it to get good at it.
That's a good way to put it.
So what we're saying is try to use exacerbate and exasperate when you're talking to people or writing. Don't be afraid to experiment a little.
Exactly. The more you use them, the more confident you'll feel.
And who knows, maybe you'll even impress your friends with your amazing vocabulary. But before we move on, let's think about everything we've learned so far. We've talked about the definitions and the little differences in meaning, and even how we can use these words to understand the world around us. Yeah, it feels like we've learned so much, but I think there's still more to uncover.
You're right. And sometimes it's those like little things that really trip people up. Like, remember those optical illusions where the lines look different lengths, but they're really the same? Exacerbate and exasperate are kind of like that.
Okay.
They seem similar, but they're actually different.
So how can we tell them apart? What should we be looking for?
Well, one big difference is what comes after the verb. In grammar, we call that the object.
Okay, hold on. Remind me what object means. I haven't been in school for a while.
Uh-huh. No worries. The object is the thing that the verb is happening to. Like in the sentence, the rain exacerbated the traffic. The object is the traffic.
Right.
Because it's the thing that the rain is making worse.
So what does that tell us about exacerbate?
It tells us that you always exacerbate a thing, like a problem, a conflict, or a symptom.
So you can't exacerbate a person.
Right. You can only exacerbate something that's happening to them.
Okay.
But with exasperating, the thing after the verb is usually a person.
So, like, I can exasperate my parents or my boss.
Exactly. You're talking about how someone feels, not about making a situation worse.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it now. So if I say, my roommate's loud music is exacerbating my stress levels, I'm talking about how the music is making my stress worse.
Yeah, the music isn't causing your stress, but it's making it worse.
But if I say, my roommate's loud music is exasperating me, then I'm talking about how annoyed I feel.
That's it. You got it. You're describing how you feel, not what's actually happening.
This makes so much more sense now. I feel like I've had a breakthrough.
Awesome. That's what we like to hear. And remember, those little differences in meaning can make a big difference in how people understand you.
So if I don't want people to misunderstand me, I need to be careful about which word I use.
Exactly. You have to really think about what you want to say.
I think that's a great lesson from our deep dive today. We started with the dictionary definitions, and now we're talking about all these tiny differences in meaning. We even talked about how these words describe the world around us.
I know, it's been such a cool journey.
It has. But now it's your turn, dear listener. Take what you've learned today and use it in your own life.
Here's something to think about. Pay attention to how you're using exasperate. Are you using them right? Are you thinking about those little differences we talked about?
And most importantly, how can you use these words to say what you really mean and make people listen to you? Keep thinking, keep learning, and keep on diving deep.